with Hyrox Ottawa coming up this weekend, followed by the Ottawa race weekend the next weekend, which of course includes, marathon, half marathon, and other options as well. I want to talk briefly about training for multiple different events as a hybrid athlete. So, number one, is it doable to train for different events at the same time? And the answer, of course, obviously is yes. It's absolutely doable, but it's certainly not an optimal way to be training and competing. So, what I generally mean by that is I think when you're training for multiple events, there's a couple different ways that your performance could go down. So, best case scenario is you're going to be great at one of the events and mediocre at the other one. More likely case, you're probably going to be okay at both, but not hitting your full potential in either. And I'd say absolute worst case, you overtrain, you have poor performance in both, which is obviously just not a fun situation to be in when you're competing and you're just not at your best. With all that being said, though, provided that you're not getting injured, there's really nothing wrong with any of these situations. This is sort of what being a hybrid athlete is all about, is being able to compete and to push yourselves in different training modalities and different kinds of competitions. Really all about being well-rounded. So, as I said, absolutely nothing wrong with pushing yourself in multiple domains here. Now, despite my little warning at the start that it's not optimal, I can hear you saying, screw it. I'm doing it anyways. I'm doing multiple competitions. I've got them planned into the calendar. So I want to break down some advice on how to best go about training and planning for these races. So number one, I think the highest leverage point you have here is absolutely whenever possible, spread out these events, ideally by at least a few months. Um, Obviously, this is going to be a challenge depending on what exactly the events are. There's only so much you can do. For example, with what I mentioned at the start, if you're doing Hyrox Ottawa and you want to do Ottawa race weekend, it'd be nice if we could choose when these events were scheduled, but they're back-to-back weekends, so you've got to make the most of the situation. But if you are able to spread it out, ideally by a few months, the key benefit here is this allows you to periodize your training. So let's say, we had Hyrox Ottawa this coming weekend, and, you had a few months to prepare for that. You can really tailor your training to make it Hyrox specific in the months leading up to that. And then let's say the race weekend instead of next weekend, or sorry, the weekend after Hyrox, let's say it was in, July, something like that, a couple months after. Well, then you could do a block from mid-May up until July, where you've got 2 months or so of mostly marathon specific or whatever distance you're running in the race weekend, to train specifically for that and get a lot more specific adaptation for marathon running. I'll add on another point here about if you're doing multiple different competitions like this, try and pick two different events that work well together. So, for example, a Hyrox and a half marathon would be pretty good. There's probably a similar, similar length. The half marathon probably slightly longer than the Hyrox, but the overall event length and um, intensity is going to be similar there. Versus, as another example, like if you choose a bodybuilding show and a marathon, probably not as great. I mean, they're they're very opposite goals here, right? With bodybuilding, you want to be putting on as much muscle as you can generally. And if you're trying to run a marathon at the same time, all that muscle just going to be weighing you down and making your running probably less efficient. And then at the same time, uh, when you're cutting down for your bodybuilding show, you're going to be in a pretty significant calorie deficit, which is not going to be ideal for fueling for your marathon, especially deeper you get into that. Carbs is probably one of the first elements to go. And when it comes to endurance training, carbs are definitely one of the top priorities for fueling, especially for long runs, that sort of thing. If you are going to do multiple events that are in a close time proximity to each other, I'd encourage you to consider if one is more important to to you than the other event. And if you identify that, then think about how you can skew your training towards that event. So if you're training for both the Hyrox and marathon, you pick one, then if you're geared more towards Hyrox, maybe you're placing more emphasis on doing those big Hyrox circuits. If you decide the marathon's more important, then the long runs are absolutely the focus, and maybe you're willing to compromise some of the quality of your Hyrox sessions to get in a better and longer long runs as you build up towards those two races. And the way that you sort of skew your training is absolutely going to help determine what scenario you end up in terms of what I mentioned earlier of, being great at one, okay at the other, or, okay at both, or not so great at either one of them. If you really prioritize one event in your training, you're probably going to be much better at that one. If you decide to do a pretty even split between the two events that you're training for, then you're probably going to be okay at both, but maybe not great at either one of them. And one more note about that is that if you are going to be training for multiple events at the same time, you're probably going to be doing very high training volume. This is already, quite common for things like a Hyrox or a marathon. And so with that comes a big responsibility on your end to me, there's three big things you've got to get dialed in. So number one is your recovery. Number two, fueling. So when you're doing, big Hyrox circuit workouts or, long runs, or you've got days with double training sessions, you've really got to get that fueling dialed in so that your body is ready to perform and execute on each training session. And then, of course, final one is sleep. There's no question that if you're going to have a high training load, this does tie in with the recovery, but you absolutely need to be in great sleep so that you're able to recover and actually let your body have the opportunity to adapt to the stimulus that you're giving it. I want to round this off by talking a little bit about my experience of training for two different events at roughly the same time. What my experience was, how it worked for me. So in this past fall, I did both a Hyrox and a marathon. So the Hyrox was it was in Toronto, start of October, and the marathon I did late November. So there's about a month and a half in between. I'll start off by saying that I hit my marathon time goal, and I miss my Hyrox goal. And I'll dive into a second about I think what some of the key things were. But to give you an idea of where I was with my training, leading up to the Hyrox, I built my long run up to 25K, which that to me, it ended up being far too long, and there was a few issues with it. So first, I was carrying all my water and fuel with me throughout those long runs. So, I would guess I had at least an extra 6-7 pounds on me for every run. Mostly the weight of the water. but there's absolutely a weight cost to running with that. And as a result, my pace slowed down quite a bit. So, I was probably running a minute and a half slower per kilometer during those long runs than my Hyrox pace. Uh, and there's just not a ton of carryover when when there's that big of a discrepancy. A typical zone two pace for me without all the extra weight and on, like a 10K run would probably only be like a 45-second difference uh, between that zone two pace and a Hyrox pace. Um, Another big factor for me was that I couldn't really do much else on those long run days. So when I compare that to now, where for this current Hyrox prep, I'd built up to a 17K long run where, it was only about an hour and a half. Wasn't having to bring much with me other than a little bit of water, maybe a half liter or so, which would only be about a pound of extra weight. And then after that 17K session, I was still ready to get into the gym, do a couple, two exercises for upper body, and maybe like a half hour cross training session. And to me, it felt like that day was much more productive now than it was where in the fall I would do those 25K long runs. And even if I did make it to the gym to do that, a couple exercises of upper body, I was just completely gassed and wasn't really executing to my fullest ability on that workout. So, with that being said, uh, I did really enjoy the experience of doing both races, of course, but I found that there's too much conflict between the two different stimuluses. And what I did find was when I was done with the Hyrox training, and I still did a little bit of maintenance work for to keep me prepared to do another Hyrox in the future. But when I was able to dial in my training, so I was just focusing on the running, really dialed back on strength training volume and circuit volume, and I was able to ramp up the running. Uh, I was able to execute on those long runs, and the tempo and interval runs, they were at great paces. And with that, I was able to go in and hit my target time for the marathon, which of course I was quite happy about. And I think it's quite interesting that I was able to do that when that was really the main focus for a month and a half versus coming into Hyrox when I kind of had two different focuses. So I hope that gives you some insight on you know whether training for multiple different events is possible, which of course it is, and some of the considerations and best ways to go about it. If you're looking for help with your training for some of these different events, um, whether you're just training for a single event at a time or you're trying to do both concurrently, you can check out my app, Harvard Strength Fitness. It'll put together programs for all kinds of different training modalities. You can combine multiple together, and it'll build something to match your goals and bring you to your best performance yet.